Hello all. This is your asynchronous lecture for Thursday, June 2nd. So I will be out of town tomorrow, unable to answer my emails until the afternoon. If you do have questions or get lost, again, I will be available. So let's just show you where to find all of these things, okay? Again, course modules is where you're going to navigate most of this. In the course modules, you'll go to this week one, and the video will be there. Obviously, if you're watching this, you've made it to the video. I will link this as well in an announcement. And a reminder that introduce yourself is due this week, as well as homework at number 1. So make sure you get signed up on Mastering Biology. Lab 3 will also be done today. I will make sure that there's a posted video there. I believe I have one from a previous semester. So hopefully this will all be good. Okay, let's go through the activity. Okay, so we're going to start on natural selection. Basically, we're going to be looking at natural selection as a theory, and then all the evidence that exists for natural selection as a so realize I need to press the share screen button when I'm not next to people. It is hard to remember to share my screen. So all right, I'm looking at the side, which is where this is. I actually might switch these around. Now I'll look at the side. Okay. Again, with the Panopto video, you can switch where my picture is. So you can have me in the corner, or you can have these side by side. I like it in the corner, but anyways. So natural selection. We'll be talking a little bit about dolphins later on in this section, how dolphins came to live on land and the evidence that supports that. But this is going to be slightly faster than our normal lectures because you guys won't be interacting and I won't have any activities where we discuss something, okay? So a little bit shorter, but it'll be good. All right. So here is these fish. Hey, Frank, when I evolved to walk on land, sure. Ew, it's dry and smelly up here, and there are spiders. Let's stay up just long enough to evolve internal fertilization. Perfect. That's where dolphins come from. Sort of. Dolphins are mammals that once they were living on land for a while, they returned to the sea. Very close relationship to hippos, and we'll talk about what evidence we have for that. Evolution by natural selection. It's a very important idea in modern biology. It helps us understand where all of our traits and various pieces come from. What makes us us? What makes us human? What differentiates us from the rest of other organisms? And how are we similar to other organisms? Not just how we're different. It's one of the best supported theories in the history of scientific research. Like, seriously, this is extremely well supported. Anyone who says that there's not evidence for evolution probably hasn't studied evolution as you guys are doing. Evolution is one of the 5 key attributes of life. There has to be the ability to change and shift, or organisms wouldn't be able to survive in a variety of places. We would have just stayed as that one single molecule in the one single molecule of life, instead of changing and shifting into now multicellular organisms. Populations evolve or change through time. So Charles Darwin, we talked about him briefly before, but he published on the origin of species by means of natural selection in 1859. This is different than the prevailing idea, which was special creation. Number one idea is that species are independent, unrelated. So this is special creation. The concept that God pointed at each one thing and went, you are a cat, you are a donkey. And cats and donkeys have no relationship to each other. They are independent, unevolved creatures, spontaneously created. Life on Earth is also very young, less than 6,000 years old. And humans are as old as everything else. species are also immutable. They do not change over time, and you should not observe them changing. The issue is that science doesn't support the theory of special creation. Scientific theories are comprised of two components. There's the pattern component, statement about facts, how things are, and there's the process component. We've talked about this a little bit before. We talked about the pattern, that everything's made up of cells, and the process. Well, all cells come from other cells. That's how, because all life, everything that's alive has cells. So all cells must come from other cells. So that's the pattern and process for cell theory that we talked about in great detail. Now we have to talk about the pattern and process here. A lot of people back in Darwin's time frame did think that there was a pattern of organisms appearing to be related to each other. There were many different traits in organisms that mirrored our own. The process was the difficulty, and also the process ran into these spiritual, religious blocks. Things can't be related to each other, because then that would negate our 6,000-year-old time frame. Then that would negate God created each individual animal independently. Okay, so, but the pattern was clear to many scientists, and many scientists who started out as theologians as well. All right, this theory of evolution is described as revolutionary. Okay, so natural selection being the process by which the pattern of similar traits and similar organisms occurred. So a scientific revolution replaces an existing idea about nature with a radically different idea. If you guys have ever heard of Copernicus and Galileo, Copernicus determined that we are not fixed in space, that we are a part of a series of rotating bodies. Galileo indicated that we are not rotating, that the sun is not rotating around us. We instead are rotating around the sun. That was revolutionary and changed the entire way of how we viewed Earth in the cosmos. And there was a lot of pushback towards that because it was very different than everything. And the idea of special creation had dominated ideas about what organisms were in Western civilization for 2,000 years. So 2,000 years ago, Greek philosopher Plato claimed that every organism was this perfect essence, this archetype, the perfect part of it. Every cat is a perfect cat. Every monkey is a perfect monkey, and every human is a perfect human. Okay, God created each one of them, and they are unique and unrelated. These types are unchanging, and this is called typological thinking. The idea is that any relationship to other organisms was coincidence. This is just the best way to create an animal. So God created all of us with skeletons. Again, species are unchanging types, and variations within species are either unimportant, as in, oh, this is just the best way to make a creature, or misleading. The devil's trying to trick us into thinking that God didn't make us, okay? So Aristotle proposed that species were organized in a sequence, up a ladder. The idea is inanimate matter, rocks and such, very far from God. Plants and invertebrates were alive, but did not have any knowledge of God. And then as you get closer into these live-bearing vertebrates, things that are closer to us, it's a pattern that God has created, okay? And that humans are at the top of that. We are the pinnacle of creation, higher than everything else. Aristotle's ideas were popular in scientific and religious circles. Species of fixed types. Some species are higher or better. Remember, better than others, okay? And so this is a great chain of being. And the idea is that angels are non-material species. And God is at the top. And humans are better than everything else, and angels are better than us. But this was crumbling a little in the course of scientific thought, right around the time that Darwin started moving towards proposing this theory, there was a lot of other scientific thought that was breaking through and indicating that maybe something is amiss here. For instance, James Hutton proposed that Earth is shaped by geologic forces. And these geologic forces, what we have observed of them, take place over extremely long periods of time, millions, not thousands of years. So Earth is much older than the previously thought 6,000 years. Thomas Malthus was another influence on many people who had thought about evolution. We'll talk about really what his thoughts were later, but he talked about this principle of populations, that human population and by extrapolation, animal populations and plant populations will grow faster than space and food supplies needed to sustain it. The idea that certain organisms and certain people are better adapted in some way to survive, and they survive best. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, inspired somewhat by Malthus, published this theory of an inheritance of acquired traits. We will go through his ideas, but even though the theory was flawed, he did actually propose that everything was related in some way. This is a big jump now from each individual species is unrelated and God created them individually. This is a break from the typological thinking. In 1831, after Lamarck, Charles Darwin set sail on the HMS Beagle, and we will talk about the Beagle next week. So this voyage would provide him with vast amounts of evidence that leads to his theory of evolution. We'll talk about the evidence that Darwin collected in particular. Charles Lyell proposed more about the processes that have shaped Earth's geological features. In fact, he became Darwin's mentor over time, shaping a lot of how Darwin thought, because this showed the history of fossils and the age of fossils based on geology, leading to this longer time frame of evolution. Years later, over 20 years after he set sail, Darwin worked with Alfred Wallace to do the evolution of natural selection theory, a short paper describing the process of natural selection. And in 1859, he published his omnibus, his magnum opus, his Origin of Species, or Origin. And we'll watch a short video next week to describe the history here. So let's start with a few of these people. Lamarck in particular. So Lamarck was the first to propose evolution as change through time, that organisms were actually changing. So this again is a break from typology, but he did not step out far enough. Instead, he proposed that the great chain of being was still true, and organisms were merely progressing through time to higher forms. The idea is that simple organisms originated at the base spontaneously, bacteria, flies, etc. But they don't come from anywhere, that they're created. Sort of this God that sort of like creates stuff, but lets them progress on their own, okay? Lamarckian evolution is very progressive. The idea that individuals are changing to get better and better over time, and that's where evolution comes from. So from worse to better. So this process responsible was the inheritance of acquired traits. So the idea that he said was for giraffes, okay? You have the short-necked giraffe ancestor that couldn't quite reach, but through grit and tough, it tried and tried, and as it stretched, it lengthened its neck a little bit. And then it passed on that longer neck to its offspring. And it was driven by this need to improve. And then this slightly longer necked individual that was born of the shorter necked one, of the stretching neck one, then has stretches his neck more to get longer and has babies with even longer necks. So this is individuals are changing and passing their traits on to their babies. So individuals' phenotype will change in response to environmental challenges. And these phenotypic changes are passed on to offspring, learned characteristics that change your lifetime. And Lamarck's idea was that organisms are only getting better. So it was only the product of bettering that changed the organism. Problem is, we also know that many organisms get sick and die. Why don't they pass that on to their children, or get sick, or have a poor constitution, or are not very, or have a defect? Do they pass that to their children? So if the inheritance of acquired traits was true, why would only good characteristics pass down? This is a huge hole in Lamarck's concept, because he was saying organisms get better over time. But what if an organism is not good and has children? Why aren't the bad characteristics passed down too? It only seems to be the product of bettering oneself that passes down. And there is no clear way it passes down. That wasn't clear to Lamarck at all. This would mean that if a mother breaks their arm while pregnant with a baby, they would have a baby with a broken arm. If they have a deformed leg due to birth trauma, then their children will have deformed legs. And this doesn't match with the betterment concept of Lamarck. So bodybuilders, give birth to buff babies, or tattoos, are they inheritable? Darwin and Wallace took it a step further. Instead of saying that individuals, through trying hard, could change themselves and their offspring, they proposed that this change over time instead doesn't follow a linear and progressive pattern. It is based on variation, so populations varying within a group, and survival. So this is a population change, not an individual change. Individuals remain the same throughout their lifespan, but it's dependent on how many offspring they make. Now, I don't know if you guys have seen this movie. I find it a hilarious movie. Not quite true, but the concept remains. The survival of the fittest, which is what Darwin and Wallace has, what if it was applied to smart and dumb people? Dumb people seem to have a ton of babies. Smart people struggle to have one or two. And this is the concept the movie's based on. And so eventually we're all going to be dumb, because the more babies you produce, the more the dumbness is passed down. Now, this is very simplifying, but it's a funny movie. Idiocracy. But Darwin says it is more based on who's having babies, right? So Lamarck indicates that this is individual-based, acquired traits that the organisms try to obtain, and that their phenotype changes, and then they pass that on. Darwin says that no, it's population-based. The individuals don't change at all, but the environment is selecting for or against specific phenotypes, what organisms look like or what traits they have. And the individuals in the population become more and more like a single type. So their view uses population thinking rather than typological thinking. So Darwin claims the variation among individuals in the population was the key to understanding the nature of species. So instead of like Popeye, this typological thought of I am what I am and that's all I am, versus a variation in a population that leads to a set of specific traits for a species. It was revolutionary for several reasons. One of them is that it overturned this idea that species are static and unchanging, okay? Again, Lamarck's did that, but his did not have the science to back it up. Replace this typological thinking. Every species is a specific type, and that type is better or worse than another type. But now we have population thinking, that populations change over time and groups change over time, not individuals. and it was scientific. This is one of the most important things. There is evidence for so many pieces of evolution. There are predictions you can make based off of Darwin's assertions. And those predictions have almost completely been shown to be true. He proposed a mechanism that could account for change over time, and that mechanism has been backed up over and over and over again. His predictions could be tested and tested with multiple avenues of thought. And again, they all center on all the predictions are coming true. And I'm going to explain some of the major lines of evidence for natural selection as the evolutionary process. So again, the pattern. Descent with modification. There's an ancestral species that are turning into the modern species. Okay. So these change through time. How does it change through time? The process is natural selection. Again, all this is evidence-based. So we're going to talk about all these: fossil record, transitional species, homologies, contemporary evolution. So let's start with fossils. The deal is, remember that Charles Darwin was influenced by Charles Lyell. Lyell indicated that fossils, you find these fossils that when they're deeper down, when they've been covered by more dirt, that long period of time relative to others are very old when they're lower down and very young up at the top. These sedimentary rocks, slow sediment building up over time, forming from sand or mud and forming in layers. The younger layers are deposited on top of the older layers. And so what can be seen is that in the older layers, there are a lot of species that no longer exist and are more different than today's species, than the more recent ones that are more similar to the species today. And that tracks with a slow change over time. So this geologic time frame, the geologic record indicates the Earth was much, much older than 6,000 years old, millions and millions of years. And again, people even today who are 6-day creationists do try to explain this away, the 6,000-year-old, 7,000-year-old individuals, okay? So yeah, if you don't believe in evolution, where do you think all these fossils came from? They were put here by Satan to test our faith. Wow, give me a break. You know, here's Satan actually burying fossils, saying, how many giant lizards does it take for these people to realize it's a prank? So this is the idea. It obviously doesn't make sense to have this misleading fossils. And I will tell you the truth, I have heard someone say this exact same thing, and it is baffling to me. But again, the concept here is that individuals try to explain this away, but really, how did those fossils get so deep, and why are they so different? The theory of natural selection says that environments changed over time, and certain traits that were once beneficial are no longer beneficial. And so in older rock layers, we find these trilobites, which have been extinct for millions of years. As we move up, we find an abundance of ferns, which are no longer the primary plants that exist on this planet, though they do still exist, but they are different ferns than exist today. And finally, the tracks from a mammal-like reptile up here, showing a very similar, a mammal and a similar mammal that lives in that area, but with reptile-like traits. So now we have this progression over time, and as shown by the fossil record. So absolute ages can also be assigned through radioactive dating. Now, I don't need you guys to know how radioactive dating works, but the basic concept is that radioactivity is understandable. Basically, if you have, let's say, 2 million if you have 2 million carbon molecules, about 1% of them will be of the radioactive kind, C14. That's just naturally how that is, okay? Radioactive C14. And C14 itself has a half-life that's predictable. It will decay into carbon 12 at a predictable rate. So the issue now is that we can, if we know the number of molecules that exist there, and we look for how many radioactive molecules should be there, and we compare it to the amount that is there, we can actually define how old this fossil is. The early signs of life were found in rocks about 3.4 to 3.8 billion years ago. And the Earth itself is thought to be about 6 billion years old. One of the biggest lines of evidence, as shown by the fossil record, is that extinction changes species present through time. So many fossils provide evidence for extinct species. If species were unchanging and perfect, why would so many of them have gone extinct? And why are there so many fossils that don't match any organism that lives on Earth today? Darwin interpreted this vast amounts of extinction as evidence that species are dynamic and change over time in response to environmental change. The environment changes, and so therefore certain species go extinct and certain species survive. The array of species living on Earth has changed through time due to the Earth changing. And the fossil record suggests that over 99% of all species on Earth are now extinct. What's living on Earth today is only 1% of what has ever lived on Earth. And extinctions have occurred continuously throughout Earth's history and are still occurring today, even ones that are not human caused. So for instance, there used to be these giant moose extinct. Organisms today that are alive, we call extant, like humans. There used to be woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and giant sloths. And now there aren't, which means that something changed so that they no longer were able to survive, but their relatives, regular elephants, and the closest relative to the saber-toothed tiger would be something similar to a cougar. It's actually not that related to a tiger. Smaller sloths all exist, but altered from the state that they used to be. We also have evidence of current examples of change over time. Things are changing right now, and we can observe them changing. Contemporary populations are currently undergoing evolutionary change, even not through speciation, just changing their traits in response to a change in the environment. For instance, bacteria are actively evolving resistance to drugs. There are many penicillin-resistant bacteria. There's not that many that existed before penicillin was a common drug. Why? Because only the penicillin-resistant strains survive and become more common. And that pattern exists everywhere. Insects themselves have evolved resistance to pesticides. Used to be that pesticides worked a lot better, and now only the ones that are resistant to the pesticides survived and have babies and now are more abundant. All of this tracks with the natural selection process. Weedy plants have evolved resistance to herbicides. Bird migration, insect emergence, and blooming of flowers are all actively changing right now and can be observed changing due to climate change. This all shows evidence that species are dynamic, changing, and not static, and their traits, even in individual populations, even in the same species, change over time. We discussed why my skin is white in our first lecture. I'm white because in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, in England, where my ancestors evolved, darker skin was a detriment to vitamin D, absorption. And darker melanistic skin was not needed because there wasn't enough sun to justify it. And so losing it was because the people who had darker skin died of vitamin D, the lack of vitamin D. And those who had higher vitamin D and lighter skin had better fertility. This is contemporary change. We can see that pattern of skin color across the world. Nearer to the equator, darker, farther away from the equator, lighter. And this pattern exists all throughout, even Asian populations. You see that Indian individuals who are not very closely related to African populations, Indian individuals are very dark. They didn't lose their melanism when they moved north because they were still close to the equator. But the further north, Mongolians and Russians did. Another case study that is often used is a snapshot in time here, the peppered moth, okay? So peppered moth comes in two different patterns. There is the light morph and the dark morph. The dark morph is a melanistic version. It's basically white and dark skin here, okay? It's a melanistic version of the lighter one. These are rare in the normal population. As you can see, the lighter one, well, it's very well camouflaged against the white bark of an aspen tree, their normal habitat. But when the Industrial Revolution began and throughout Europe, train tracks snaked through these areas. Near the train track, the trees would blacken with soot. And in those areas where the trees blackened with soot, the moths survived, but the most abundant morph was the black moth. And the white moths became scarce. This is a change in trait frequency, which is what evolution is. The trait that was beneficial for that environment became more common, and the trait that was non-beneficial became less common. The trait didn't disappear, but perhaps longer term it would. Another piece of evidence is the similar species in the same geographic area, indicating that they're all closely related. So the Galapagos mockingbirds, so Charles Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands where he was inspired by many of these species that appeared to be so similar with slight differences that made them well adapted for the specific habitat they lived in. These 4 mockingbirds are extremely similar, but each have distinct traits. This mockingbird has a longer and more curved beak and is paler in some areas. This one was smaller bodied and had a thinner beak. All of them were obviously mockingbirds, but none of them bred with each other, and each one ate a different diet. And Darwin proposed that the mockingbirds were similar, not due to coincidence, because mockingbird style birds just happened there, but that they all came from a common ancestor, the mainland mockingbird, which no longer exists. Recent DNA analyses support Darwin's hypothesis. They've actually shown that that the DNA sequences are very similar in each of these mockingbirds. And the closer the islands are that the mockingbirds are on, the more similar the DNA, which makes the most amount of sense. One of the key things with understanding how theories work is that they should be like, oh, well, that makes sense. It should be understandable and it should be clear why this is happening. It makes sense. So this phylogenetic tree is an ancestor-descendant relationship. We will go through exactly how phylogenetic trees work later this semester. But mockingbird and DNA mockingbird DNA were placed on a phylogenetic tree, and they are each other's closest living relatives. They share a single common ancestor that obviously flew to all of these locations. And then based on the environmental things on that island, birds with certain traits survived and birds with certain traits died. And a different set of them lived or died on different islands. Closer the islands are together, the more likely the mockingbirds in those were able to interact and breed together for a long period of time. So we see here, San Cristobal is the most different than everything else. It's also the furthest from the rest of these. So this would have been where the common ancestor flew over and populated this one first, and then others of the common ancestor flew to these islands, which all share the same species, and they're all very closely related. And then you see a different set of them flew to Hispaniola, and a different set flew to Floriana, and they have different environments. The more different the environment and the further away they are from other islands, the more different the DNA. And that makes sense if we assume that the common ancestor is the same for all of them. We come up with this very understandable pattern. The closer they are together, physically, the closer they are together genetically. Another way is to see these transitional features that link species. The fossil species, the fossil patterns again, are strikingly similar to living species in the same geographic area. If you have a living species that has a hoof, you are very likely to find a hoofed fossil in that area. But if there's none with hooves, you will not find hooves in that area, which shows that the ones that are fossilized are the ancestors, and the ones that are living today are the descendants. This is the law of succession. It makes sense, right? Darwin interpreted this as evidence that species are changing through time, and that the extinct and living forms are related and represented the ancestors and descendants, instead of just being coincidentally related, that they actually literally were the parents and the children in a sense. So these traits in extinct species are intermediate between the ancestral species and the derived species. So the idea here is that species change through time, and ancestral ones are slowly morphing into the descendants over time. Data like this is consistent with the predictions from the theory of evolution. The species are being selected for survival via this natural selection pattern. Ones that survive have more babies, and those babies become more frequent, and those traits become more frequent. If the traits observed in more recent species evolve from traits in more ancient species, then transitional forms occur. For instance, we have 385 million years ago, this pattern in a fish bone. Okay, we have the distal elements, the ulna, the radius, and the humerus. Tiktaalik, which you may have heard of Tiktaalik, it's been the source of many memes, 375 million years ago, has the same pattern, but looking more like a hand now. Acanthostega, these longer fingers now. And then again, transitional, still the same basic pattern, but a transition from fin to foot. And we have this pattern for many different traits, including the formation of a skull, teeth, eyeballs, etc. Another thing that these transitional forms mean is that we also get vestigial traits. Vestigial trait is a reduced or incompletely developed structure in an organism that has no function or a strongly reduced function. The idea is that it should be functional in an ancestral species, but have lost its function in the current species. Clearly similar to functioning organisms. Functioning organs, okay? For instance, whales lack back legs, but there are some species of whales that have a pelvic bone, The pelvic bone is at the base of your waist here. It connects your legs to your torso. But whales have no back legs. Why would they have a pelvis? And the answer is that their ancestors had back legs. And the pelvis is a vestigial trait, a remnant of what once was in their ancestors. If we look at a bird wing, we see all of the digits of a hand. Birds are related to dinosaurs. And we see this thumb. We see this pinky. And they're reduced and they don't work the same way anymore, but they're still present. They didn't get rid of the bones. And that's what a vestigial trait is. These fish have eye sockets and no eyes. Their eyes didn't fall out. They were born with no eyes. Living in a cave, they do not have the need to detect light because it's completely dark. But once the eyeballs had been reduced, so they didn't put the effort into having eyeballs and they didn't get injuries in their eyes, why take out the eye socket? There's no evolutionary pressure to get rid of the eye socket. And so you can see why these eyeless fish did not always, that line did not always have no eyes. Their ancestors had eyes. Finally, this is the back end of an echidna. Echidnas have this heel spur. And echidnas are closely related to platypuses. Platypuses have poison in this heel spur. Echidna do not. Echidna evolved after platypi. And it actually still has a tube in it that no longer contains venom. So the answer is, we now see if they're closely related and they have a heel spur and they have a line where the venom should have come out from, but no venom. And they have evolved to have no venom. They're clearly related to platypi, which are the only other organisms that have a working poisonous heel spur. All right, so non-functional hypoleg bones in snakes and whales, reduced wings in flightless birds, eye sockets and eyeless cave-dwelling fish, non-venomous heel spur in echidnas. Okay, so for instance, this extratarsal, the heel spur, that had venom, existed in the common ancestor of all of mammals. The extratarsal spur was lost, and the venom was lost in marsupials like possums and wallabies and kangaroos, and in placental mammals. But the sexually dimorphic venom, okay, only occurring in males, that exists in the platypi. And echidna, they still have the extratarsal spur. They still have the tube that the venom goes in, but they have no venom. But the fact that we have fossils that indicate that a similar species closely related to echidna and platypi had venom, and then the echidna has the exact same trait, showing that it used to have a venom sac but is now gone. Well, that indicates that they must be closely related to platypi. And that's a clear pattern of ancestor to descendant patterns. So are there any vestigial traits in humans? Humans have vestigial traits. They may not be the ones that you think. Now, one of them is pretty clear. We all have a tailbone. This tailbone is a remnant of, well, a monkey tail. The human coccyx, the vestigial tail, means that it became less and less beneficial for us to have a tail due to us sitting down and standing up. And we didn't need the tail to balance when we were standing. And once the tail got so short that it went inside of our bodies. There was no more evolutionary pressure to get rid of the tail. And so the tail, those couple of vertebrae remained sitting just past there. If we had evolved without a tail, we would have our vertebrae just stop at the bottom. Why have this extra bit? And it's because our ancestors had tails. And that's evidence of it. So looking for evidence of evolution, you're sitting on it. So when you get scared, you get goosebumps. When you get, additionally, when you get cold, you get goosebumps. Do goosebumps help anything? Not really. They make you feel a little weird, but goosebumps do not actually help us in any way. But does it help other creatures? If you have a cat or a dog, you may have observed this. This is an adorable kitten who is attempting very hard to look as big and scary as possible. When cats get scared, they floof up, the tail, their back. I have a tailless cat, so she just poofs up her back. She's getting goosebumps. The goosebumps make fur stick up on end, and when they're scared, it provides a defense by looking bigger than they actually are, puffing up that fur around us. And additionally, if you were cold and you got goosebumps, then you would fluff up your body and you would become warmer due to basically trapping air within it. If you've ever looked outside in a cold morning and seen a robin puffed up on a branch, I've definitely seen this. You've observed that organisms that have feathers and fur do this, but fur in particular can be poofed up to act as a warm blanket. This tells us our ancestors had fur, because goosebumps currently serve no purpose besides feeling weird to us. One of the last evidences we're going to talk about is the evidence of homology. Homology is similar to existent species that descends from a common ancestor. So there's genetic homology, that we have similar DNA, RNA, or amino acid sequences to other species. And that's really one of the most telling, that we all share DNA, and that DNA only varies in a couple of nucleotides. Developmental, we see that similarities in our embryonic form because there is no evolutionary pressure to change what our embryonic forms look like. And so our embryonic forms have things like gills and tails, which we don't, but it's a hallmark of what used to be. Structures. Adult structures are similar as well. I already showed you that pattern over time, that transitional. We can also see, just in related species, the similar patterns of limbs, let's say. So genetic homology is an interesting one, is that here's this mouse gene. Okay, this is a type of eye gene that tells you where do your eyes go. There's a gene in fruit flies that has been discovered that is 76% similar to the mouse, and the protein is 100% the same as the mouse creates. This similarity is telling in that is likely 76% because flies diverged a long time ago, but the gene to control where your eyes go is beneficial in multiple organisms. Sharks are the same thing, eye control gene, 85% similar to mouse. And actually, sharks are more closely related to mice than flies are related to mice. And flatworms, very distantly related to mice, 71% genetic similarity. This is a fascinating piece here. Okay. Developmental homology is similar. So these three embryos look very similar. There's a tail, there are these gills, and there is so these gill pouches. Okay, chickens, humans. You wouldn't have pegged that one for a human, huh? And cats. They look so different. They look so similar. And look, they all have the gill pouches and they all have the tail. But chickens don't have the same kind of tail. And humans don't have gills. What does it mean? It means that we are descended from organisms with gills and tails. Common vertebrate ancestors of these species had gill pouches and a tail. Structural homology is just what you would see in the current existing species. I showed you transitional species in the fossil record, but even we can see that we are related to birds and horses and turtles by just looking at the structure of our hands. We all have the same pattern: humerus, radius and ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. And we all have those, even if it's a hoof phalange versus a finger phalange. We all have them. And that pattern hasn't changed, just a slight reorganization or elongation of certain ones. So structural homology is a similar in adult morphology, indicating that our ancestors had this same limb setup. The three levels of homology interact. Genetic homologies cause the developmental homologies in embryos. Developmental homologies lead to the structural homologies in adults. The most fundamental homology is the genetic code. That's where all the instructions come from to make every trait in our bodies. Nearly all living organisms also use the same code for translating the language of DNA into the language of proteins, this central dogma. And that's the most telling, in that every single organism, including bacteria, do this because we all are descended from a common ancestor. All right, so there is the final thing I'm going to show you is how to get to an activity. This activity will be due next week, but is a understanding homology and analogy. Again, in the lecture assignments, and I will post this in the same thing. So there's going to be 2 activities. One activity is the sea slug activity that we discussed yesterday, and one is going to be this homology and analogy activity. And they're both going to be due next week, 1 week away from when they were assigned. It's not always going to be true, but I'm going to give you guys some space for these, okay? All right, so here is just a rundown of the evidence for evolution. Species are not static, change through time. Life on Earth is ancient. Most species have got extinct. Fossil extinct species resemble living species. Transitional species document change in time. Vestigial traits are common. We see the characteristics of population vary within species. Closely related species live in the same geographic area. Homologous traits are common and recognized at 3 levels. The formation of new species can be observed today. These are all patterns. They're recognized and true across the world. And all of these are huge amounts of evidence. Actually, evolution is more backed up than even the theory of gravity. My husband is a physicist, and he has told me, he's like, there's so much we don't understand about gravity. So much. We don't even have a central theory of physics. Everything's different at different levels of size. The tiny, the big, it all seems to work differently. There's a lot we don't understand about physics. And we understand so much more about evolution because the evidence is clear, and it all happens in animals and plants and bacteria that we can clearly see and document and get data on. A little hard to get data on gravitational waves and such, which are hard to detect. Okay, so again, I'm going to, let me show you just briefly what this looks like. And again, here we go. This shows you the biological thing. What you need to do is go through this whole piece, okay? Go through this whole homology and analogy, and you're going to get to the very end, and it's going to say, congratulations, you did it. There's a quiz question, you answer it correctly. Congratulations, you did it. You answer it wrong, just go back, answer the other one, and go forward. But make sure you understand why you're answering it, okay? This is going to give you 3 points next week. All right, that's all I have for today. And again, I hope you're watching this on Thursday. You will be tested on this next week. And I will see you guys on Monday.